Morning, everyone. Good to see you guys. It's fun that we get to do this despite the circumstances. I'm glad we're still able to run these roundtables. Mark and I are going to split the content this morning. We have two topics that we wanted to cover and run these as discussions. I think both of us prepared somewhere between 30 and 40 slides to walk you through, 4 or 5 slides to walk you through sort of what we're thinking about from a concept perspective. And then, really just have it be driven as a discussion. So I'm going to head things off this morning and talk about social engineering and, really have that be probably as discussion focused as we can. I've got a couple of things to sort of set the table. And then I'm sure Mark's going to weave in, but when we kind of come to the end of that portion of the conversation, we'll try to put that somewhere between 15 and 25 minutes, somewhere in that time frame. Hand it over to Mark and talk about the expanding role of security and talk a bit about some of the new challenges around business continuity, disaster recovery, the expanding CISO landscape. Mark, if you're still with us, I don't know if you've frozen yet, but good. Do you want to say anything?
Sorry, that was me. So good morning, everybody. As you know, Kevin and I are two of the co-chairs for this group, so we're happy to be here today. My half of the conversation, Kevin will do a great segue for me over. I just want to talk about how things are adapting, because I can imagine that there are many folks on the phone in the security space that have new responsibilities in this COVID-19 era that you may have just inherited over the past 3 months. So I really want to talk about that, because there are some interesting things to think about with respect to that. I'm going to turn it over to Kevin. So Kevin, you're going to fire off first, and then we'll riff on each other. Folks, if you have questions, Sarah, how are we doing questions? Are people just raising their hand, or are they just kind of leaning in?
So again, this helps if your camera's on so we can see. You can sort of raise your hand, or you can turn your mic off. You can also use the chat function, and I'll monitor that. Kevin and Mark, you do not have to do that.
Okay.
So yeah, again, just easiest if you keep your cameras on so that we can see if you have questions, but we can use the other functions as well.
Yeah, and look, I'm sure like all of you, we're on interminable Zooms week after week, so we've all gotten pretty good at this. Jump in, interrupt, it's not, we have some slides mainly because it's easier to sit in front of a screen and look at something for a minute, but we're here to have a conversation, and this is why our slides are really thin. This isn't us presenting to you, it's just setting a stage for a conversation around it. And that's a good segue into, why we're talking about social engineering to start. One of the things that Sarah and Mark and Debbie and I were talking about over the course of the last few months is what the world looks like for the security community. And with everyone remote, it's almost become over-marketed that our worlds have changed, remote workforce has to be protected, et cetera. But there's a kernel of truth in that, despite the marketing that has been layered on top of it, which is that we are now dealing with a reality in which our people are remote. And, I come from a very different background from any of you because I'm not a CISO, right? I'm a CEO of a tech startup, but we work with organizations dealing with the social engineering problem day in and day out. And so I spend most of my days either on internal Zooms or on Zooms with prospects and customers. And so there are some trends that we're hearing. We thought that was an interesting jumping off point for this conversation. And I zoomed all the way back out and said, okay, what's the macro on the social engineering? Why are we talking about this? And, DBIR, for better or worse, gives a great 50,000-foot view of the problem. And if you go and look at all the data breaches, right, not the incidents, because incidents skew heavily towards DOS attacks because they're easy for obvious reasons. But if you think about what the breach stats look like, approximately a third of all breaches that actually get reported have at some point in time, usually on the far left side of the breach timeline, a social engineering phishing campaign. And social engineering is almost universally 80% of the time a phishing related incident. And why? It's the same people rob banks, right? It's the easy way to get to what you're trying to get at. It's where you go to actually trick someone. It's good to see Dan's face on the call. I had the pleasure of working with Dan 20 years ago, my goodness. in the Aztec days. And I was young and super early and wasn't doing any really fun stuff, but we had a whole range of services and social engineering. I don't think it was phishing in those days, right? Like if you roll the clock back 20 years, the social engineering network was literal social engineering where you would maybe show up and trail someone into a building dressed like a FedEx employee. Yes, there was some email, but it was easier to get someone over the phone or get physical access to a server room. That time has passed. And now if we're talking about social engineering, we're probably talking, and the stats bear it out, about email-based social engineering. And I have a maybe iconoclastic, maybe not view. I think there are only two problems remaining in the email space of note. And I don't mean that there's only two things you need to do when you protect against social engineering and phishing. But I think that if we look at the world of threat, the stuff that we all were dealing with 20 years ago, do I have email deliverability? Can somebody hack my Exchange or Notes, I'll date myself system and take it offline? Yeah, that stuff's gotten much harder with O365 and G Suite taking over as the dominant email platforms. And there's still a need for things like encryption, and there's still ostensibly a need for archiving, but a lot of that stuff is being driven back to the platform level. But the problems that we see and that we hear are, one, impersonation attacks, and two, credential theft. Almost 60% of the time when, or 68% of the time when somebody gets in and there's an actual breach, it involves credential theft. And phishing is simply a mechanism for executing a credential theft attack. You still see about half of all breaches have a hacking component to them. Targeted, breaking into software vulnerabilities, breaking into systems. There's a world of companies that will help you on this front. But the easiest thing to do is to make someone think that they're getting an email from their boss, from someone they know, et cetera. And so, we were watching, and these are our kind of aggregate stats last year, but an 80% increase in the email world of emails that impersonate not just the business email compromise side, but we're seeing impersonations of services people use, impersonations of vendors. The more insidious side of that is that if that works, we'll see a multivariate attack where maybe somebody compromises an external contact. And we saw this at a hospital where a vendor was popped through a social engineering attack. They gave their credentials for someone in their finance department to the attacker. And the attacker then watched that email exchange. Their target was this hospital, and they waited and then inserted a ACH change message into the thread and said, "Oh, I realize we're about to do this. We've changed banks. Can you please change the routing number to this?" And that is the more difficult problem in many ways, right? So social engineering in the please wire me $1 million still happens, but we see less and less of it. And what's now starting to happen is can I use an impersonation attack to go after a soft target, move east-west, and then get into a spot where I can get someone to do something because it's now what looks like legitimate email. And I think that as we think about this problem space, you can see it, and Marc's going to talk about the expanding roles in the COVID world, but social engineering has three primary things that it looks for: opportunity, medium, and urgency. So opportunity, you have to be a soft target in some fashion, right? If your organization, we have manufacturing organizations we work with, or I can look at all the companies that I've been on the vendor side for over the years, if we are talking about a supermarket conglomerate, the vast majority of their staff aren't on email. And so the social engineering that will happen for financial fraud is probably going to be POS and not email driven, although still a concern on the finance side of the house. But for most organizations that are using email regularly and it's deployed in their knowledge worker based, okay, you have opportunity. Then you have to have a medium for doing it. So orgs are getting better at hardening their own email infrastructure. And we can talk about, I think I saw one of the folks, Macronis, joined us today. There's a bunch you can do as you start to think about all of the defense in depth strategy around protecting yourself. And there's things that are very useful that you can put together into a coherent model for protecting against malware or hacking, etc. But there's a certain ability to impersonate external people, even if you've hardened your own environment, that allows that to come through and look legitimate or steal credentials from them. But I think the final thing is urgency, right? And if somebody is emotionally susceptible, then they're going to be a good target. And emotional susceptibility in the most base form is, I'm the CEO and you better do this right now. We get these, they're hilarious. I apparently ask for the cell phone numbers of my finance people on a weekly basis. And these are great. I love that we get hit with phishing attacks as a company that does email security. And we look at these things and we all have a good laugh. But the more sophisticated ones, and the one on the right, that's pulled from a real client environment, obviously redacted, but that's pulled from my threat intel guys, because we started tracking the COVID-19 related phishing threat landscape, and we started doing it right after RSA. We backported and saw, there's almost nothing happening January, February, because the only people who were talking about this were talking about the outbreak in China, or a few of our epidemiologist contacts in hospitals were starting to have exchanges. But it jumps enormously, as you can imagine, into March and April, and it's starting to fall off a little bit. But that emotional resonance point is what you see in these attacks, and you guys get this. I don't need to hammer on it, but there's a credential theft attack and an impersonation happening. In this case, it was trivial; it's the help desk, but that will continue. And as we start seeing people go back to work, Mark and I were having a conversation with Sarah just before we jumped in here. Everyone is thinking about opening their office up. What do you need to do? You need to have some sort of PPE. You need to have thermometers and masks, and those are in short supply. So we're starting to look at this and say, well, what's going to happen is that HR departments are going to start getting phishing emails that say, do you want to purchase your thermometers here? Do you want to purchase your PPE? Because it's an emotionally fraught topic. And so that's sort of the opening gambit for this conversation as we think about what social engineering is looking like. The points that I thought might be a useful jumping off point for the conversation, and I'm curious what you're all seeing and doing, are: one, it's probably coming over email. Two, it's probably ripped from the headlines in some fashion. Everyone gets the fake voicemail or the fake SharePoint share or the password reset, and that stuff important, but relatively well known. But as we're in this moment, what does that look like with more people remote, harder to turn around and say, hey, is this real? And a lot of emotion woven into the communications we're having. And I'll stop there. I think that's the end of my slides, and just setting the table for a conversation around what you're seeing and how you're responding, and we'll take it from there.
So Kevin, I guess I can start. So I'll give you guys a real world example. So part of my other role, I'm the vice president of InfraGard, the kind of public-private partnership with the FBI, and we also staff one of the business liaison desk at Massachusetts Emergency Management. So I guess this is kind of a non-dire, we get all businesses around the Commonwealth calling into that number. And I guess on a positive note, I don't know how many mails and phone calls we've gotten from business constituents across the Commonwealth that are getting these phishing attempts and then routing them back to us because they don't know what to do. They're, hey, I've got this guy or gal or company trying to sell me masks. They're trying to sell me thermometers. They want me to click on this. What should I do? So I guess the positive aspect of it is at least folks are recognizing that they probably shouldn't click on that thing, but I do think there's probably a gap somewhere and they're not quite sure what to do once they get it, because they're desperate, to your point, Kevin. They all need to open, just like we all are going to open eventually, and they need gear. I was joking with these folks earlier that I had to get thermometers and hand sanitizer, and I bought them out of the back of a van in order to get our company back operational, because you just can't get them. He was a friend of mine. It wasn't bootleg stuff, but similarly, these folks are desperate. They know they need to open. They know they need the stuff in order to meet the Commonwealth's guidelines to reopen. They just don't know what to do, because if it was real, they really need the stuff they need to get there. They just don't know. So I guess the positive thing my experience has been over the last 2 months, people are recognizing it. The negative thing is they're not quite really sure what to do. So back to kind of, what do we do to try to inform these folks to make good judgments?
Well, I think there's, and that's a great open question. And that's a great open question. But I think there's a question there that says, should we do this?
What was that, Kevin? I lost you there for a second.
Yeah, we're getting some echo. I think the open question that comes out of that is, do we do this as a training exercise? Is this something where, if you have enough security awareness training, people will know not to fall for it? And, I have my perception, which is that the answer to that is no, and that training is a piece of, but not the entirety of this. Has anyone here implemented a MSOR approach to this yet? It's kind of the new Gartner whatever. We'll see if it actually takes off, but there's this concept that, you think about what we're talking about, and it's no longer a product that you buy. It's a category that has security awareness training and mail authentication and email security supplements and what you're doing at your gateway level, et cetera, and it's designed to say basically there's no one size fits all solution, and you have to in some fashion do mail specific security orchestration in order to address the problem. And I don't know if I believe it yet. It sounds a little Gartner acronym-y, but maybe. And I think that's the idea, is that the Gartner acronyms, they're usually so that you'll buy Gartner licenses or go to their events, but sometimes they're onto something, and sometimes they're talking to people and hearing people say, yeah, I am rethinking my strategy. Walter, you were nodding, so I'm curious what your thoughts are.
I'm always very skeptical of Gartner. Everything that comes from Gartner seems to be in Gartner's best interest, and they tend to try to push the industry to think of things the way they think of things, even when there's already existing categories and already existing thought structures around something. It's got to be done Gartner's way. It's got to be done Gartner's way.
Mark, did you have
That
something?
was weird hearing myself.
Yeah,
I did hearing myself.
Yeah,
I didn't have anything to say, Sarah. I'm having a problem.
I mean, are you guys seeing this with your people? What's the sort of landscape look like with your teams being, I assume, remote, and how are you addressing it? Have you stepped up training? Is it not an issue? Is it something that is top of mind? What's that look like?
So this is Dan. It's definitely top of mind. We do self-phish testing, and I'm sad to say the click rates are up. People are definitely falling for more that plays directly into their fears and anxiety around the pandemic. So, they're immediately clicking on things that say, here's your package tracking information or something else related to COVID-19. Thankfully, they're still pretty good at identifying all the other stuff and filtering that out. It's something that we're discussing now, and we will definitely be stepping up some of the education. But honestly, with you, Kevin, the training only does so much, and it's clearly not completely effective, or people wouldn't be clicking on this stuff. We've tried to give them tips along the way. When we were in the office, we would have posters around the office. We have to think of new creative ways, given that we're still shut down and will be for the foreseeable future. There's a chance we're going to open June 1st for our global offices, but that seems to be not the current date anymore. And I don't know when it's going to be. So we're going to continue to be working with everybody from home for quite a while.
The work from home hasn't adjusted our spam ratio at all. I'm taking a look at the last 3 months of tickets created by folks reporting spam. And that seems to be fairly constant. We tried to do a phishing exercise where we tried to get something through our spam filters, and that failed miserably. They could not get the phishing exercise through our spam filters. So that was interesting to note too.
Others? Anybody else? I see you, Roman.
I see him over there. He doesn't have his camera on though.
There he is. Ah.
It's yeah, no, our world is actually pretty status quo. We've been heavy on the phishing front for a couple of years now. We have a lot of automation, so I wouldn't call it what Gartner phrases it, but the premise is the same, right? We've daisy chained system loggings response to identify something, determine if it's singular or persistent, and then go rip the rest out of people's mailboxes, make any other changes necessary. I've kind of got, I'll call it slightly easier, right? My team has been intact for a couple of years, so yeah, there really was no disruption in terms of, oh, everyone's remote. Most of the company, or I'd say more than half the company, worked remote regardless. So functionally, it was transparent. People are learning how to actually adjust to meetings when you're not in the same room, but otherwise, from a security and technical perspective, our challenges have been very different in that we're going through an integration, and that integration involves very different tech stacks, and the cascade between them and the capabilities we've built in our company versus our new parent company, and kind of trying to understand what we're losing, how it's going to change, and not break our current state. So we've kind of been in a different place, but at least on the social engineering and phishing front, right? We don't, and we haven't simulated and tested employees. We get enough real world phishing pretty much daily that we take that and we turn those into articles that we publish to the company. We take screenshots of things we're getting. We leverage what's already happening as part of our awareness. So that's kind of what our take on that is.
I think it's interesting that, Roman, is you're alluding to, sort of the changing role that you're facing, and you're facing it in part because of acquisition and merger. But, I think that that's the other half of the equation, is we all have similar but slightly different experiences around what this transition looks like and what our roles are as we're now responsible for more. Our teams are remote. Dan saying that they're seeing more people falling for phishing attacks than they do a SIM, and you saying that we've got a different tech stack. Actually, I think it's a nice segue into what Marc was going to talk about, which is what this is doing to our roles in aggregate and what it looks like. Marc, do you want to pick up that thread of conversation?
That was a great segue, Kevin, I must admit. Thank you, Roman, for the tee up, Kevin, for the segue. So let me just get the Prezzo up here in 1 second. Let's see, share will not allow me to share, Sarah.
Just so you know, we practiced our seamless.
Need this up, yeah.
Except what happened, Marc? You exited out, so I have to just turn this over.
Give it back to me.
Seeing our tech support in real time here.
We did practice this.
We totally did. It was so perfect.
There.
Here we go.
All right. And there, I can see that. I'm gonna see that. Go right to the takeaways. If the thing will load. I'll go back to the top. So we're going to talk about everybody's kind of new universe. I try to give the universe theme for this particular one because I think, what I've heard from some of our constituents out there is that, with C19 coming into purview, their roles have been modified, sometimes dramatically, sometimes small, but I think it was worth a conversation to talk about some of the new disciplines which you as a CISO may now be responsible for in the organization that you never had responsibility for before. So quickly, most folks know me on the call, Marc French, co-chair. What I wanted to do is talk a little bit about kind of what it looked like in these slides for folks that have gone through the boot camp, the CISO boot camp we did a little while back. Well, the first two will look vaguely familiar because it's part of our blueprint program, excuse me, I can't even talk, it's Friday morning. Our boot camp program. And then we're going to talk about really two topics: crisis management and business continuity and disaster recovery. And then I did want to actually leave with a few takeaways. And the last particular one, Colin, if you can stay through the end, is an interesting conversation that dovetails with the one that you gave back a while on CCPA and insurance. So I'm interested in your perspective on the last bullet of the last slide, sir. So I'm going to try to keep you in all the way through. So let's get started. So this is going to look probably very familiar to most folks in the Prezzo. This is your world, right? You're a CISO or a senior security executive at an organization. You probably run all of these disciplines. You have some sort of infrastructure security program that's got some ARC and vol management. You've got a compliance function that's doing some training, backing up what Kevin was saying earlier. You've got maybe an AppSec program that's doing security development and some disclosure process. And you might have a SOC, or you've outsourced your SOC, and you may have a threat intelligence function. And I think the key here on this slide is, because this is wash, rinse, repeat, everybody's kind of doing this thing, is incident management, right? So we all deal with incidents, to Kevin's point about engineering, and Roman had made mention earlier, you're dealing with this on a day-to-day basis, but they tend to be a bit small scale, generally speaking. So this is the kind of segue into crisis management. All right, so what does your new world look like? So same four on the left. One of the things that I've been hearing is that, before, most CISOs did not run what they call a converged security organization. They were responsible for the technical aspects of security. But what's interesting about C19 is that there is a gap in physical security, meaning that process of managing the building and the access controls and all of that stuff sometimes sat with HR, sometimes sat with facilities. It was a little unclear. And now that you have a remote workforce, you have this how do I get back to work conversation. I'm seeing more and more organizations recognize that as the security person being the most senior risk manager in the organization, they're starting to say, well, we weren't running a converged team before, but now you should probably take over all of this function across the organization. So that's kind of tier number one. And then tier number two, especially in very large organizations, I come from EMC quite a few years ago, and this was embedded in InfoSec, this concept of business continuity and disaster recovery being owned by the CISO. And we'll get into more detail on this in a second. But underlying all of this is this concept of crisis management. So you can see from the prior slide, we talked about incident management, which I think we're all familiar with. We don't need to get into that. But crisis management is kind of that one step above incident management. So let's kind of segue into that for a second. So I guess at a macro level, probably going to get physical, likely going to have some aspects of BCDR, likely going to start to have to deal with crisis management if you haven't done it before. So that was kind of the opener to crisis management. So let's be honest, every one of us has done incidents. This is kind of what we do day in and day out. Not every one of us has done crisis. And I put the ISO definitions up there just for color, just so folks can understand. But the reality of it is, when we think about an incident, we get a ransomware attack, generally speaking, at a low level on somebody's desktop. The Security Operations Center knows how to deal with this. They work with IT, they, quarantine the box, they roll it off, and then, they do whatever recovery mechanism they have. Maybe you do some investigations and try to run it down, maybe you don't, but you're back up and operational. Think about a crisis, it's really more expansive than that. And the reason we bring this up is C19 is an example of a crisis. So if we get here, when we talk about an incident, most times we're not talking about whether or not an organization is going to survive or not. we're talking about whether that person's or even that functional area is going to get back up and operational. But from a crisis perspective, it's really that existential threat to the organization. Are we going to continue as a business? And that's a much different thought pattern than, am I going to be able to get my accounting department back up again? Because the folks that you deal with, your communication style and everything that you do is really operating at a different level with a different expanse. And I want to call this out because I'll share with you a story because I learned the hard way. So as most of you know, I was the CISO over at Endurance International Group in Burlington. Incidents all day. We used to joke that we had 30 P1s a week because it was just the nature of hosting. And so we know how to do incidents. This is something that we did, but we did experience the first crisis, and I will tell you, I was unprepared for this, to be brutally honest, because having done incidents day in and day out, you get used to it. You deal with the head of IT, you deal with the head of operations. All of a sudden you're thrust into this ecosystem where folks are looking at you at a strategic level. So you're going into the board meeting and having a conversation about what's going on in the organization. And that is, if you're not familiar and interacting with the board, that is a scary scene if you get called to task to have an emergency board meeting to talk about something that's going on. The second thing that was interesting about it was the types of communications. So when you're dealing with an incident, everybody's a tech person, you're kind of in the weeds, you're running it to ground, and you might have some folks on the periphery that you're dealing with from a comms perspective that aren't technologists. But here, no technology folks. And it was interesting to try to make sure that I could adapt my language to have the conversations at the board level and at the external level. So all of a sudden, where you and I don't know if folks have had the opportunity to go through when we ran the cyber range with IBM. Was it last year, Sarah? I believe we picked one individual to actually do that press briefing. They take you down and you're the CISO and you stand in front of the CNN person and they ask you questions. That is a much different way of thinking than you and I are normally accustomed to dealing with kind of your peers in the organization. And the magnitude of your decisions is much higher and weights on you. Because if you think about it, all right, I've got a ransomware on this particular desktop. If they go down, it's going to hurt, but it's not going to sink the company. So, kind of what I'm thinking, the reason I'm trying to highlight this is when you think about C19, and we'll talk through this in a second. When you think about C19, I think more and more CISOs are starting to take on this role of crisis management over and above incident management. And I think the reason for that personally is you all are seen as the person to go to when this thing's happen. There are plenty of folks, they're all smart. Your CFO is smart, he understands, right? Your CEO, sorry, Kevin, and the other folks, they're smart in their own discipline, but you have the background in managing this type of activity. So I think what I'm seeing more and more is that the CISOs in the organization now are being forced to step up their game, for lack of a better description, into this crisis management role, because now there are threats to the business that may cause that business to stop, and you are the natural choice to do this activity within the organization. So it's interesting, if you look at very large organizations, and we'll use EMC as an example, they have a function for crisis management, and I know they have one over at TJX as well. This is all they do every day because of the number of crises that they have. We see this in a lot of mid-level organizations is there's a group, they form a crisis management that's got someone from public relations, it's probably the CISO, there's somebody from facilities, there's somebody from HR. And then I'll be honest with you, what I see in smaller organizations that we deal with all the time is it's the CISO. They don't really have anybody else, and they look to you to be the crisis management team for the organization with maybe some support from other aspects of the org. So kind of really what I wanted to focus in on is this is a function that you as a CISO need to start to get your hands around, because in some form or fashion, and C19 is probably maybe the first time you've experienced this, this is going to be part of your remit going forward, whether you're a participant or whether the owner. They're going to look to you as the primary incident responder to have a voice in this particular process. And a lot of, there's some training that you can get, and we can talk about that at the end, but I think this is something you guys are going to need to start to focus in on, because it's going to be part of your role and it's not going to go away, post C19. Make sense? Questions on that? I'm going to pause for a second. So let's talk about business continuity and disaster recovery. So I think everybody mostly understands, but I put this up here just for clarity so we can understand the difference between the two. So disaster recovery, bringing your IT systems and operations back online. Business continuity, bringing your business back in line. And they are different, and they tend to be run from different parts of the organization. So disaster recovery, you guys probably experience it all the time. If you're a SaaS vendor, things go down, things come back. You've got hot sites, cold sites. You're running redundancy across multiple availability zones in AWS. That is a function that, as a technology provider, for those of you that are in technology, you're pretty familiar with. Business continuity is something that's probably come to light with C19, because really what it's about is making sure your business can get back and functional again. And we just talked about it with trying to get masks, making sure that people aren't getting sick in the office, making sure we can get people all back in the office. That historically I've seen in most organizations has not had as much focus as disaster recovery. It has now come to the forefront with C19, because I think most people did not have business continuity plans, and they're now forced into this BC arena. That, all right, I know how to bring my systems back up and online. I don't know how to bring my people back up and online into the organization. So where does the CISO come in? I'll be honest with you, what I've seen happen in most organizations, pretty much across the spectrum of small to enterprise, is the focus of disaster recovery tends to sit in the IT and operations space. It is a technology focused thing, and there's a part to play, obviously, from an investigations perspective and follow up by the CISO, but the function of disaster recovery tends to sit inside the technology space. Conversely, I would say in the business continuity space, it's not as clear cut. I think historically it's kind of maybe lived in facilities, maybe lived in HR, but the reality is what I see most often happen is it's a function of the physical security department, because they have access control, they have perimeter security of the building. So what does that mean for you as a CISO? Well, as you saw, if we cycle all the way back to a few screens prior, the likelihood that you're going to take on physical security is now going to rise as a result of this. So therefore, you're probably going to likely be the primary person for business continuity in the environment. So it's an interesting, kind of additive thing that's happened in your role, that all of a sudden, here you are, you're a technologist, you've got your AppSec program, right? You're running your high trust certification for medical, and all of a sudden these physical security guys come up, and now you have to worry about, who can get in and out of the building, and should I put turnstiles for my folks to roll in, and then all of a sudden on top of that, C19 hits, and you've got to now start worrying about how to get folks back in the building, how to socially distance people, how to get thermometers for folks to get back into the building. And even though you may not own the tactical aspects of it, the fact that you're the functional risk manager and most senior risk manager in most organizations means that they're looking to you for guidance. So the likelihood that you're going to have to take charge of this function has gone up dramatically, because I really think, except for the very large organizations, most organizations that we deal with, this kind of caught them by surprise. They didn't really have much of a business continuity plan. Most of them had a solid disaster recovery plan. That's the nature of the business that we're in. But most of them really didn't have a business continuity plan. They don't know where to turn. And to be honest, they're going to turn to you. You have experience in this. Well, they think you have experience in this. You may or you may not. But they're going to look to you as that risk manager to help them on this journey, because they're not going to know. They're reading documents. They're going to the human resources groups. They're trying to understand that, but they this is what you do. You've got some battlefield experience dealing with incidents. They look to you in times of crisis already, or mini crises. They're going to be looking to you to help them get through this business continuity crisis that they're experiencing with C19. I'll do some takeaways and then we'll open it up for questions. So I guess I've got 5 takeaways. We're almost there, Colin. I'll get you on the last one. Recognize these are things that are coming your way. So the question you have to ask yourself is, are you leading or are you following? The reality of it is that you are likely the most senior risk manager in the organization. Now's the time for you to decide, are you going to step up to these new arenas or are you going to follow? And it's kind of a harsh statement, but you all need to think about this, because many organizations are suffering a little bit, and you need to decide, where your position is in the org. The second thing I would say is start a crisis management team. You probably already have one today in C19. If you don't, you should probably get one, because that means that things are happening in a silo and your back to work scenario may not end as well as you would hope. So I would strongly urge you guys to get a crisis management platform. There are a bunch of folks and resources that we can talk about offline. People can send to me that I can send your way, but you really need to start this practice. The third one's interesting. I put this in there and then I thought about this. You have a part to play in business continuity. You may own it. If you don't own it, you need to get involved with it. Back to the first one, be proactive in the new areas. I think even with the remote workforce, you have visibility sometimes into arenas that the rest of the organization doesn't, because you know where people's laptops are, you know where they live. You have a part to play. You need to decide how big it is, but don't think that you don't have a part to play in business continuity. Fourth is practice, practice, practice. I think I joke about this one because I think we're all practicing right now in C19, but if you're not and you've got an infrastructure there, I do think that this needs to be part of your regular cadence, just like you would do tabletop exercises, just like you would do red, purple team exercises. This has got to start getting into your cadence of exercises that the team conducts on a periodic basis, annually at best, at least. The last one's interesting, and Colin, the reason I'm calling you out, because you briefly mentioned it in the CCPA one. More and more so, especially in the smaller organizations, the concepts around insurance with cyber insurance and some of the other things are falling into the purview of the CISO in some form or fashion. One of the things that's kind of out there is look to your insurance provider. There's a positive aspect and a negative aspect to this. So the positive aspect is, just like they have incident response resources that you can lean in through your cyber insurance policy, they will have resources to assist you from a crisis management perspective. So they have a preferred vendor list. Take advantage of that, like you can take advantage of that from your insurance provider for IR and forensic services. The negative part of that is, and I've seen this, is a lot of so you go ahead and you buy an insurance policy, more and more providers are opting not to pay for the business interruption aspects of this, even though their policy may be there to say that. And I think we can relate from a cyber perspective, because we have been caught with this. And Colin, this is my segue to you for a second. Not every cyber insurance policy pays out every time you have a claim, because they're going to take advantage of whatever clause in there to not pay. So, what I would say to you is, insurance is a good thing. You should have it, but you probably need to lean in and figure out how your insurance provider can help you in this situation. But be prepared for the long slog, I'll call it, in case they decide to not help you. So, Colin, the reason I called you out on this is, you probably had some experience in the role that you have at Foley around kind of this activity of providers assisting with crisis management, not assisting with crisis management. So I'm putting you on the spot, sir. I got it. It would be helpful to share some of your experience with this last one.
Yeah, well, and Mark, I appreciate the opportunity. I mean, I think you're right that the experience under policies can run the gamut. At the one end, I can remember, and it wasn't cyber, but one insurance company actually, they were so desperate to pay out because they were a captive insurer and they had to meet certain levels. They were like, tell us what we can pay and we'll pay it. Just send us bills. And it was amazing. And at the other end, you see folks, it's trench warfare to try to get them to do anything because, ultimately they don't make money if they pay claims. The vast majority of folks tend to be in the middle. And that's why your point is exactly right, that you got to work that relationship leading up to it to take advantage of those situations, because that's where we see most of the things. So, but if you do it right, you've thought about it beforehand in terms of both getting the policy and what you're going to do with it when bad things happen. So again, as you say, you've practiced this. It's part of the business continuity and disaster recovery effort is to know, all right, who am I going to call? What are we going to say? What's our position going to be with regard to the insurance so that we can get the best possible outcome? And frankly, that you've talked about it with your broker and maybe the company with whom the policy is placed to go through all these scenarios. Because the best of all was to go back to them a year after you did that and say, remember this is exactly what we talked about. You're going to cover it, right? What can they say at that point? They can't look you in the face and say, no, we're not going to pay it. Because if they do, they know they're going to get sued and they're going to lose because they've said these things about what it's going to cover. So your point of practicing just extends onto this. Now, that's an idealized view. I will tell you that in most cases, that level of inquiry and practice does not happen, but I would like to see that going with companies going forward.
Thank you, sir. So question for the group, as you experience the C19 piece, are you all seeing your roles in crisis management and BT expanding? I'm just kind of a straw poll of folks in the group, or is it pretty much stayed the same?
Mark, do you want to stop sharing so we can see?
Oh yeah, sorry, I'll do that.
Oh no, that way you can see faces for your poll.
There we go.
Are we just raising hands, or is there a formal poll functionality in here, or what?
I think we're just gonna raise your hand, Dan.
All right.
We haven't figured out the poll thing. It's Dan, then Walter, and then Michael. So Dan, you first.
Well, I mean, we had a business continuity plan that I put in place a couple of years ago. It doesn't directly cover pandemic as much as we'd like. That's a scenario that we were planning on adding this year, and now we have some real life experience to add into it. But it always included creating and standing up a crisis management team to help coordinate across the different business functions and liaise with management and get the feedback from everybody across the various departments. So we did spin that up, even though the plan isn't specifically pandemic, and have been running that since mid-March, meeting a couple times a week. And the management team is really doing it as well, and feeding information back down. We have crisis management sort of being directed through our marketing department, and we have a retainer with a crisis management firm should we need it. Thankfully, so far we haven't. Our company is not terribly affected by COVID at this point from an industry and revenue perspective. We haven't needed to sort of formally declare any kind of crisis. Your points around the physical security are certainly relevant. IT is generally on the access card system, will be auditing the access on a periodic basis. Security is stepping up and monitoring who's going into the offices more frequently now, because we didn't turn off badge access in case people needed something.
And Dan, who chairs? So you said marketing chairs your crisis management team?
No, they own the crisis management function and any communications and sort of spearheading how we would draft that with legal and the rest of the management team. But I'm actually chairing the crisis management team that is part of the business continuity plan. So for internal coordination.
And one interesting thing, back when I did my first BC plan at EMC a long time ago, it was SARS H1N1. So we actually had a pandemic portion of the plan. And, those tended to drop off after a while, right? We forget about those things. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe FFIEC as part of their examiner portion actually requires you to have a pandemic plan as part of that. So those folks that are kind of regulated by FFIEC actually probably had this as part of their plan, because I think it never was removed from the examiner.
I think it's still there. I've seen the reference to that, and I came from Fidelity before this job, and they definitely had the pandemic, and during H1N1, they gave out Tamiflu to everybody.
Oh, yeah.
We don't have those kind of resources. But for reference, since you were talking about sort of who owns it, they're obviously much larger than we are, being a small SaaS provider, but they have business continuity being run from the corporate risk function, separate from security.
Walter, you were next up.
We had a crisis management plan as well as both business continuity and disaster recovery plans. So when this first came about, the crisis management team met. They instituted a response immediately, everybody working from home. We had the infrastructure in place to support that. Our prime challenge was helping onboard folks. Since in both Argentina and in India, the quarantine was a strict one where you couldn't get them corporate computers. So we had to change our provisioning methodology so that we could support folks working off of home computers, but still deploy to them our security software. Took us about a week to get that right. And once we had that right, we've had just situation as normal, except everybody's working from home. Our productivity has actually gone up across the enterprise. We haven't seen an uptake in security incidents at all, not phishing or any other kind. What's been interesting is that the crisis management team consists primarily of human resources, information technology, and legal. It's owned by information technology, not by information security. They view it as their job to keep the company up and running from a technology point of view. I'm in violent agreement with that. I don't think this is a security function, even though availability fits within the security function. I think that's more availability under attack. I really think that this is an IT challenge and an opportunity for IT to shine. And in our case, I've been there as a advisor as needed, provided some suggestions to improve things. Certainly, getting the security software, the anti-malware, the DNS filtering, things like that onto folks' home computers was something that they had not planned for. So that was my role, was to help them fill in the gaps. But other than that, our plan worked as planned. I'm very happy with it.
I think Michael raised his hand, but I did see in the chat that he ducked out. So I think that was the last question we had. Sarah, we're down to 1.5 minutes, so I don't know if we want to try to wrap.
Yeah, let's wrap it up. I think, again, this is recorded, so this will be available. I know Kevin added in his MSOR acronym, Mail Specific Security Orchestration, Automation, and Response.
Got a couple questions about that, so I put it out for everyone to see what we said. Yeah,
no, exactly. I think when we have it recorded, I don't think you can see the chat, so that's why I wanted to make sure I called that out. And then the slides will be included in the recording as well. So thank you all for coming. We haven't done a ton in security since this all started. I know Debbie led a tabletop with the CISO leader, as well as Chris Hart from Foley Hoag, but we haven't done too much. And I think, it's a great opportunity for us to continue building here. So if you have thoughts, ideas, anything that you want us to share, you can send them to myself or Mark or Kevin or Debbie Briggs, who's not on the call today. and we can, start to put some of that into action. And again, I just want to thank Deloitte, our community sponsor, and our global sponsors. And I see one more chat.
That's me, my email address there, and Mark.
Yes,
Sarah,
Kevin's email address.
So we've got our contact details if you want to get in touch with us.
Yeah, and you see Mark's right there too. Or if you don't get to these quick enough, just email me. I can share those as well. So thanks, everybody. Enjoy your weekend. Enjoy your Friday. Mark and Kevin, thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Good conversation.
Everybody.
Thank you. Thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, good to
Thanks,
see you all.
Walter.